and saying that the focus upon travelers or merchants or great conquerors and so forth is elitist and ultimately not terribly rewarding, although it has some wonderful stories to tell. What I'm much more interested in the term of in the notion of intersocietal world history is the contact points between different societies with respect to religion or spiritual outlooks. And here is where I have a long-standing interest in the process of conversion to Islam. How did Islam grow as a religion? And I wrote about this long ago in a book called Conversion to Islam in the Medieval Period. And at that point, I was talking about the Middle East, specifically from northeastern Iran across to Spain, and using quantitative techniques that were innovative at that time. But I also had a simple-minded notion that you are either a Muslim or you're not a Muslim. And so that converting to Islam was sort of like a limit switch, where it's either on or off. For the purpose of the methodology I was following, that was a necessary assumption. But I was aware even then that you had people who would be Muslims in one context and not Muslims in another context. The example that came to mind most was when I had a conversation with a school teacher in Nishapur in Iran, where I was living at the time. And on a shelf in his dining room, there was a picture of Mary and Jesus, the Madonna and child, and there was a Quran. And just to make conversation, I said, well, are you a Muslim or are you a Christian? He said, well, if the missionaries would allow me to attend the English language Christian worship in Mashhad, I would be a Christian because I'd get better practice in speaking English that way. But they won't let me go to the English-speaking worship. Instead, I have to go to the Persian-speaking worship, and so I'm a Muslim instead. I thought, well, it's a very parochial example, but I'm certain that there were people in the early centuries of Islam who were on the border between being Muslims and not being Muslims. Or some of them were Muslims who were afraid of being somehow disadvantaged by saying so. And others of them were Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians who, under certain circumstances, might say they were Muslims. After all, you could say La ilaha illallah as a Christian and feel perfectly happy about that, even though it was a Muslim Arabic phrase. Now, it didn't really occur to me at that time that Islam, in sort of world historical terms, was coming into being in a world context in which it was geographically situated among several primarily monotheistic cultures: Christian culture, Jewish culture, Zoroastrian culture, between monotheism and dualism, Manichaean culture, more dualist than monotheist. But in any case, there was very little paganism, very little polytheism in the Middle East, although there was obviously some in the Arabian Peninsula. So, in a sense, the transition from polytheism to monotheism had already taken place before the rise of Islam for large segments of the population that ultimately professed the faith of Islam. In a sense, this was enormously to Islam's advantage, because by creating the notion of the people of the book, the Ahl Kitab, the Muslims were able to have a very formal and universally recognized modus vivendi between Muslims, Christians, Jews, and more or less by courtesy, Zoroastrians, so that there was no need to eradicate these other faiths, which constituted the majority of the population in the area of the armies coming from Arabia conquered, say, before the year 711. It's the result of this.
Richard, can you turn on your camera? Sorry.
Turn on my camera?
Yeah.
Start video. Unable to start video. Okay. It's not, it says I'm unable to start it. I think you have to send me some message.
You go on.
All right. Start video. Sorry, I don't see how to start it.
At the very bottom, there should be a camera. Yeah.
It says the host has stopped it.
Okay.
Metin, I think you may want to make Professor Bulliet a co-host, and that way I think he would have.
Yeah,
access.
sure. Professor Demir, can you co-host him? Mm-hmm. Sorry about the technical issues. I mean.
Says I am now a co-host.
Okay, yeah. So you can go ahead. Yeah.
There we are.
Great to
nice
see
to
you.
See you all again.
Yeah.
All right. What I was saying is that if you compare the rise of Islam with, for example, the spread of Christianity, half a millennium earlier, for the Christians, the struggle between their monotheism and the polytheism that they encountered in Europe and in many parts of the Middle East as well was a more or less a life and death struggle. And Christianity was quite militant in eliminating polytheists. They basically said, you either become Christian or we'll kill you or enslave you. And they destroyed the temples, and they destroyed the sacred groves of trees, and they got rid of the druids, and got rid of the priests. And in a sense, Christianity, because of this struggle for survival in its early days, it became a religion that was oriented toward militancy. Islam became oriented toward accommodation because it was coming into being within a lot broader society that was already largely monotheist and which formally was considered populated by people who were akin to Muslims. Ironically, the militancy of Christianity and the comparative tendency toward accommodation among Muslims has been reversed in the politicized atmosphere of contemporary times, when you have people who maintain that that Islam is a religion of violence and so on. And I think that is a ridiculous point of view to have. But just to refresh people's memories, Samuel Huntington said, "Islam's borders are bloody, and so are its innards. The fundamental problem for the West is not Islamic fundamentalism. It is Islam, a different civilization whose people are convinced of the superiority of their culture and are obsessed with the inferiority of their power." Now, that is a highly polemical thing, but it has certainly taken root, highly polemical opinion, but it's taken root in the Islamophobia that is now so common in Europe and America, where basically you have long-standing Christian societies in which people believe that Muslims really are not people you can get along with. It's a kind of militancy that has deep roots in Christianity, but it's very hard to find that sort of depth of feeling in Islam, even though there are certainly periods and episodes of violence and militancy by Muslims throughout the last 14 centuries. So I thought when I worked on conversion that I was looking at a phenomenon that could be somewhat generalized but as I looked more at how Islam spreads outside of the Middle East, I became very aware that my notion of conversion was too limited. Now you have to keep in mind when we teach about Islamic history, the course, or at least the first semester of the course, goes from the time of the Prophet to the Mongol invasion. And then after the Mongol invasion, you might study the Ottoman Empire, or you might study the Safavid Empire. You might study Islam in India, various things that you could pursue. But the idea that the spread of Islam is dependent upon or closely related to a political institution that deploys armies to different areas. It led to the notion of Islam spreading by the sword, which really I think should be retired as a generality. But it also left out the fact that most of the world's Muslims are the descendants of people who converted to Islam after 1258, which is when the caliphate formally comes to an end with the destruction of Baghdad by the Mongols under Hulagu Khan. Okay, what do I mean by most of the world's Muslims? If you have 1.8 billion Muslims in the world today, 0.8 of those, the 0.8 part of that sum can be made up from just the populations of 6 countries in South and Southeast Asia. Most of those areas by 1258 were not Muslim. And this is leaving out large areas of West Africa and East Africa. It's leaving out the 25, 26 billion Muslims in China. And it's very clear that most of the Muslims in the world today do not come from family roots that go back to the period of the caliphate, or not to the period of the Baghdad, or the Damascus and Baghdad caliphates. So the question is, how did Islam spread in the absence of that kind of centralized militancy that is so often associated with the story of Islam? Now, if you take that same time period, say from 1258 onward, and you look at Christianity, you'll find that most of the world's Christians today are descended from people who were not Christian, whose ancestors were not Christians in 1258. Obviously, everyone descended from the indigenous populations of the Western Hemisphere were not part of Islam. The large Christian populations in sub-Saharan Africa were not Christian at that time, and so on. I mean, it's very clear that Islam and Christianity expanded in their second phase of expansion at roughly the same time, and to a much greater degree in population terms than in their first period of expansion, the first, say, 5 centuries of Christianity and the first 5 centuries of Islam. But when it comes to Christianity, the secondary expansion is closely connected with political militancy. In other words, colonialism or imperialism and the expansion of Christianity go hand in hand, not coincidentally, but because that was built into the notion of a triumphant Christianity where the cross follows the flag, and where you had a conquistador or a explorer who planted the flag of his country. Soon you had priests who would follow and would start to convert the local population, and the conversion was often quite militant. We will not tolerate anything other than Christianity. So the interesting thing to me is that the secondary surge of Islamic growth is not, for the most part, dependent upon following the flag in terms of conquest and militancy, whereas the second period of growth of Christianity is. And this, of course, comes down to the present day, when you really have an assembly of Muslim societies around the world that do not have a single political leadership, and probably never will have again a single political leadership. Whereas you still have people who feel that there is an organized Christian church or churches that deserve to be on top of everything in the world because they have tied their history to the militancy of colonialism. Oddly enough, in the United States today, the strongest Christian groups are as militant as they've ever been, but they are often at odds with the government, at least when the government is not in evangelical hands. Okay, so what interests me in a world history terms is, how did Islam spread when it was not spreading among monotheistic populations? And it was not spreading because it was coming in the footsteps of conquest, of government expansion. What I've discovered in my reading, and here in particular, the books that have most influenced me are John Bowen's book, Muslims Through Discourse, which is about northern Sumatra, and Dick Eaton's book, Islam and the Bengal Frontier, about Bengal. And a recent manuscript I have read that for a book will soon be published by James Frankel about a history of Islam in China. And the research that I've been doing personally for the last couple of years has been on the southern Philippines, where I own a certain manuscript that has been very difficult to interpret, written in the, at least in part, in the Maranao language, which is spoken on the island of Mindanao, where most of the 5 million Filipino Muslims live. And what I've discovered in these places and through other reading is that if you think of say a diagram in which you have say a background color, let's say blue, and then you have a circle in the middle, and that's red, and that's Islam. And then that circle, the diameter will expand as the community grows vis-a-vis the background community. But that inner circle has a sort of a purple area around its circumference. In other words, you have a blending from pure Islam, so to speak, if there is such a thing, versus whatever the background is. You have these intermediate points between Islam and the local culture. So that in my Filipino work, the manuscript I'm dealing with, now that I can see what it's about, largely through the help of other scholars who can read the languages that I can't. What I now see is that this was a manuscript that was once owned by a shaman who was a Muslim, and whose the manuscript is devoted to techniques for predicting the right times and places and moments for doing such things. In other words, it was geomancy, it was prophecy, it was magic. And these same shamans, they would produce amulets, they would produce talismans, and the magic was Muslim. When you look at the language that is used in this magic, and yet at the same time, it related to basically animism that was existing on the island of Mindanao when Islam came, starting around 1300. And yet the manuscript is probably from 1900 or the late 19th century. In other words, you still had this animism coexisting with a more formal Islam hundreds of years later. And this is what John Bowen found in the Gayo highlands of Sumatra, this coexistence of an earlier form of intermediate religious society between Islam and whatever came before. And what fascinates me is that Islam is able to form intermediate religious or spiritual outlooks with almost any type of society. You can have a polytheistic society, as you have, for example, in Hindu India. And in the intermediate form, Muslims will say, well, Muhammad is an avatar of Vishnu. Well, he's Muhammad, and they recognize it that he's the founder of Islam, but as an avatar of Vishnu, he's also placed into the Hindu pantheon. Or in China, where you can say with Chinese Muslims that Confucius is the sage of the East, and Muhammad is the sage of the West, where it's true Muhammad is a prophet, Muhammad is not seen just as a sage, but this is what fits into the Chinese context. So you read and memorize the Confucian classics, and you read and memorize the Muslim classics, because the two sages feed into this intermediate form. Now, in time, these intermediate forms fade, and particularly in almost every part of the world, you develop a sort of a purist outlook that actually wants to get rid of the intermediate forms. And yet the intermediate forms survive for a long time, often in the less literate, less sort of modernized segments of the population. And yet it's all Islam. And this is what has fascinated me for many years, is how the notion of ummah, the notion that there's a world community of Islam, is incredibly tenacious and allows people from every part of the world to think that they are part of some one thing. You don't get this with any other religion. Buddhism forms intermediate spiritual types with different cultures around the world. In other words, Japanese Buddhism will be different from Tibetan Buddhism, and different from Sinhalese Buddhism, but they don't gel together. You can say they're all Buddhist, but you then give a sort of dissect that into a family tree of what type of Buddhist is here, what type of Buddhist is there. Same thing with Christianity. There are dozens of types of Christians, and you work out a genealogy and so forth. And to some degree, you can say they're all Christian, but they don't have the notion of a single cohesive community. And yet Islam does. And I've wondered for a long time why, when Islam develops a plurality of forms that it does in a very fruitful and successful way as it moves or percolates into different parts of the world, why does it the centrality of Islam as the point of identity keep reasserting itself? And here I want to get to the last part of this talk, because I think that there are certain things that I would identify as being essential to that successful retention of cohesiveness, or of a thought of cohesiveness that singles Islam out from any other culture in world civilization. And I've mentioned one, the notion of ummah, the notion that there is one community. Obviously, the notion of a political centrality, whether it's an imamate or a caliphate, does not maintain its hold. So that is not something I would point to. One of the most important ones, I think, is the Arabic writing system. It is striking that toward the very beginning of Islam, in the year 696, a decision was made by the caliph or the people around him that the coinage of the Muslim caliphate would have nothing on it but Arabic writing. And Arabic writing becomes, really from that time on, the marker of the culture of the Ummah. It doesn't work for absolutely every country. Obviously, Bengal is separate here. But by and large, wherever anyone sees the Arabic script, their instinctive thought is, well, this is something that is Muslim. And it's very peculiar that this happened because at the time of the coinage reform, non-Arabs couldn't read the Arabic script at all. And among the Arabs, you probably had fewer than 5% who were literate. So this decision to emphasize a writing system as opposed to a single symbol like a cross or a Star of David, but to take simply the alphabet and make that the signifier of the culture. That, I think, was terribly important. Then you had the calendar. That is something else that binds together this world Muslim community. Now, it binds together the community not because everyone follows the calendar in terms of their day-to-day occupations, but right now we're in Ramadan, and all Muslims everywhere are in Ramadan, and it makes no difference how Ramadan relates to the solar calendar. The Muslim societies of all sorts follow the lunar dating for Ramadan, for pilgrimage, and so on. And then pilgrimage, Hajj. This, I think, is a strikingly important aspect of Muslim identity, not from the beginning. Up until the 12th century, the pilgrimage, I don't think, was terribly important. Mecca was an isolated locale far away from most people that had very little capacity to sustain a large crowd for any length of time. But in the period of the Ayyubids, and then the Mamluks, then the Ottomans, the people who who asserted authority over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. They created the capacity for people to come on pilgrimage and sojourn in those holy cities for long periods of time. They had places they could live, schools they could go to, Sufi brotherhoods that they could be initiated into. And around the world, the intersocietal connections among Muslims were enhanced by people meeting so many people from distant places who shared their faith during the Hajj. So the Hajj becomes, in my view, the successor to the Caliphate as a central point of Islam. It's not a central point in political terms, but a central point in societal terms, because this is the place that people go to, and this is what sustains essentially the quasi-mythical notion that Islam is centered in Arabia. For example, you would not find Zen Buddhists talking about, the homeland as being where the Buddha lived in Nepal or something like that. The final thing that I would single out as being peculiar to Islam, not peculiar in its details, but peculiar in a more general sense, is the notion of sunnah. How do you there are many ways to observe the sunnah of Islam, and people will disagree as to what those important ways are. And yet, the notion that there is a shared lifestyle, what people sometimes call orthopraxy as opposed to orthodoxy, the idea that there's a shared lifestyle and that in which Muslims are comfortable with other Muslims, irrespective of where they come from in the world, that I think has been an important effect. Now, just to close, is there one aspect of Islam that is particularly salient today? And here I'd say, if Islam has shown itself effective in interacting with animistic cultures, with polytheistic cultures, with monotheistic cultures, if it has been able to form modus vivendi relations with virtually every form of social and religious, social and spiritual organization around the world over a period of 14 centuries, is there anything left? And of course, for me, the answer is that Islam and modern secularism. Here we have this question of, is there a modus vivendi between being Muslim and being active and part of and dedicated to the modern scientific world, which tends to be related to secularism, and in which the West considers itself the foremost exponent of this societal point of view, although China may be overtaking it. And I think this is the challenge, in a sense, of today for Muslims, is where is there right now you have this sort of purple border around an Islam that some people would say was pure or original or orthodox, and something that is not Muslim. And is there a way to stabilize that purple boundary and to derive a type of Islam that going into the future is both truly Muslim, but also truly part of a modern world that Islam has not been the primary creator of. And I think that if Muslims have been able to to craft ways of living with people from every other sort of society in the world, there's every reason to believe that they can do that now. But of course, as in those other parts of the world at other times, it generates internal conflicts in Islam as to who is going to be defining this intermediate zone and where the boundaries are, and how is that mission going to be carried out by the people who wish to be the expositors of a new form of Islam. I used to say in some of my classes that the history of Islam divides into 600-year periods. That you have from the beginning of Islam, the first 600 years, is primarily taken up with the Middle East becoming Muslim, and as in the process, the centrality of the political definition of Islam goes from being of maximal importance to being non-existent. Then you have another 600 years, roughly 1200 to 1800, in which you have new structures that are built upon the old spread of Islam in the Middle East, but you have a variety of very different new structures being built in other parts of the world. Then you have a period from 600 years, from 1800 to 2400. In other words, the transition point that we are now halfway through or approaching halfway through. And I think that it's important to see Islam in the broadest world history perspective as dynamic, as adaptable, and as a world spiritual, social community that has currently emerged in a fascinating stage of new dialogue with the only remaining dynamic society in the world, namely modern Western secularism. So that's what I have to say. And I guess Owen is going to take this apart now.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bulliet, for this invigorating talk. Now, his student, who graduated in 2015 from Columbia University, Owen Miller, will take the microphone and then try to put Professor Bulliet's talk in such a broader frame. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Metin, Professor Demir, of course, Professor Bulliet, for your, as always, thought-provoking and engaging, creative talk. So this morning I set out with like this enormous excitement that I would be following your lecture, which was no doubt going to get into completely new territories, right? And so in desperation, I went to my bookshelf and started going through all of the books by Professor Bulliet that I could find. I started reading books on conversion and on technology, on camels. My wife was looking at me with some concern as the day progressed, because there is so many original ideas. I mean, I can speak, I think as many students probably have the same feeling, that every single lecture I ever heard Professor Bulliet give was new. I'm not kidding about this. Before a lecture, like a regular class that I was a TA for instance, Professor Bulliet would, right before the class, be running around and looking at different texts in his room and coming up with, synthesizing and coming up with some new ideas to share with the class, and through that process in a way write. So with all of that in mind, I'd like to get into some of the things that came up today. I mean, obviously the questions of what sometimes are called, I think, rather pejoratively syncretic cultures, the ways in which the world doesn't operate through binaries, the ways in which we have to think about the purple and think about the ways in which conversion takes place. I actually prepared a little bit of kind of a talk. This is the first time I've done this in about 12 years. So the first time I've actually prepared a talk, because usually I'm just extemporaneously talk about various things that I'm engaged with. But given the kind of gravity of this in a way, I thought it would be good for me to write out a few ideas. And some of these, I think, they dovetail with what was just said. So let me just start with that. So in his short story collection, this is the Aleph and Other Stories, Jorge Borges describes how a man sets out to draw a map of the world. Now, over the course of drawing this map, over the course of this life, this individual draws mountains and seas, and at the end of this life realizes that this is a map of their own face. And I've always been struck by this, how historians are constantly writing what ends up being the kind of their experience. And my own map of the world, of course, it very much was drawn and depended on the scholarship and pedagogy of Richard Bulliet. Obviously, I'm not alone. I think I'm number 49 of PhD students, and we're talking about hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of undergraduate students who've gone through his classes. And I think most of them have left in the same way that I left, feeling inspired, as I do now. One of the things that I think I learned most from Bulliet is that history is about empathetic imagination of the lives of others, especially those far removed in space, time, and tradition. When I was 19 or so, I ended up taking a class at UC Santa Cruz with Terry Burke, and it was pretty inspiring. And I became a devotee of world history as a field. It was almost a religious conversion, actually. I was struck at the time, now this is more than half my life ago, right? How world history as a field sought to both challenge Eurocentric visions and the usual units of analysis that historians use to describe the world. This is, of course, just to take a second here, world history as a discipline is highly, highly unusual, right? This is a discipline that did not emerge like Athena from Zeus's head at the Ivy League institutions. It emerged from below. It emerged at community colleges. It emerged at public schools, right? And the World Historical Association still has many members who are high school teachers, right, in the United States. And so this is a field that's very interesting from that respect. Of course, as Professor Bulliet has noted in other lectures about this was a history with a heavy dose of ideology. One might even say faith, right? I remember feeling at that time when I was 19 that this is a kind of history that if we practice it could actually change the world, right? That it was powerful and that it didn't quite, it wasn't really about parochial histories. And as someone whose ancestors come from Europe, Africa, and Asia, I felt that this was kind of history that I could also fully identify with, right? It was a history that made me feel whole in a way. Of course, there was a lot more to the story than my own naive enthusiasm about the transformational potential of the past and the world historical way of approaching things. There was also, of course, the textbook industrial complex. Professor Bulliet once, commented when I was enthusing about this, that the big push for world history was driven more by competition among textbooks publishers, right? This is that institutional sort of history that we always have to pay attention to. So in this sense, however, I'd like to just again step back and acknowledge that Professor Bulliet is an early adopter of world history in these two different senses. One is his book, which I think Metin already mentioned, The Earth and Its Peoples, now in its 7th edition. It is wildly successful and of course has shaped the very structure of what world history has come to be through the AP exam and the way that people approach it in high school, right? And of course, Islam is a huge part of that story. So I think Metin noted that in that book, there are over 1,000 references to the word Islam. So this is a way in which many Americans have approached, and I guess people around the world actually who would have adopted this text, have learned about Islam through this sort of reading, right? This is profoundly important. Similarly, if you go on YouTube and type in Professor Bulliet or Richard Bulliet, you'll come up with these lectures on world history that have 500,000 views, right? This is tremendously important for shaping the way that we think about world history. Secondly, and I guess this gets into the kind of some of the things that Professor Bulliet talked about with infrastructural history and also with intersocietal history, right? There's histories that he has composed on the history of domestic animals, conversion, obviously a big point of today, and technologies, all of which, of course, I think what's interesting about them is they draw from many different disciplinary wells, right? So world history as a discipline has long been inspired by other disciplines as well, right? I mean, history is a very xenophobic profession for the most part, right? PhD programs generally don't accept people from other fields. World history is a little bit different in the sense that practitioners have drawn deeply from social scientific wells, from anthropology, sociology. You can see this in the work of William McNeill, Emanuel Mallerstein, Edmund Burke III, of course, Richard Bulliet, who was an early, I would almost say, American adopter of the analysis school of history. Like, you take from all sorts of different schools of thought in your inspiration. So I was reading last night Islamo-Christian Civilization, which I think is appropriate given the kind of topic that we're talking about today. And obviously, I highly recommend everyone to go out and check out that book. I recommend it in my classes. But this morning, I was reading Methodists and Muslims, which is subtitled "My Life as an Orientalist." This is a wonderful book. It's part memoir, part argument. It was recently published. In the first section, entitled "Before Arabic," Professor Bulliet describes his life in Rockford, Illinois, before arriving at Harvard as an undergraduate student, armed with a hoard of obscure information about history. That's the way he put it. It was during his sophomore year at Harvard that he began to study Arabic, back when most Americans and Europeans still were approaching the Middle East and Islam, not through the lens of social history, right? But through the disciplines of theology or philology, or both, right? But just as the 19-year-old version of me went through some sort of religious experience when I started thinking about world history as the ways that we can think imaginatively about the lives of others and make these connections across these units of analysis. The 19-year-old Dick Bulliet of Rockford, Illinois in 1959 went through what you might call a conversion process, becoming, over the time and years of study, a world historian and an Orientalist. Now, I'm gonna, again, just point out that the subtitle of the book is "My Life as an Orientalist," right? So there's actually in this book, besides a memoir, there's actually an argument about Orientalism. Edward Said famously, and an acquaintance at Harvard of Professor Bulliet, and as well as a colleague for many years at Columbia, famously argued back in the late 1970s that Orientalism was not only an academic tradition or field, or a way of drawing, but a way of drawing distinctions between the Orient and the Occident, and a powerful instrument of political domination. In other words, Orientalism has kind of embedded in it the notion that an Orientalist is mostly concerned with power, right? I think Bulliet argues that in order to understand why anyone would want to study the lives of those far removed in time, space, or tradition, we should try to understand who they are. In order to understand why anyone would become a Western scholar of Islam and Orientalist, we should try to understand their motivations by studying what he calls their pre-conversion period. The line between before and the after is rarely crystal clear. This is the kind of in between. I often describe conversion in my own classes as a two-way street. Writing his own essay on conversion back in the 1970s, Bulliet noted that he took it as axiomatic that every convert's hopes and expectations of his or her new religion bear a close relationship to their hopes and expectations of the religion they leave behind. Bulliet lays out here brilliantly both how, when he was writing his first book about the medieval patricians of Nishapur, he was inevitably thinking, at least in part, of the inhabitants of his hometown of Rockford, Illinois. This had been his map of the world up to this point, of course, but also through careful study of Arabic text, Bulliet found that the ulama families of Nishapur bore many similarities to the inhabitants of his hometown, and he outlines these brilliantly in his book. perhaps in a similar way to the way that I was enchanted as a 19-year-old with a notion of studying history that was not divided along civilizational lines, seen in such a history a way to recognize all of my ancestors. A younger version of Professor Bulliet recognized himself in the lives of others in Nishapur, far removed in time, space, and tradition. So that's what I wrote. And of course, I think it fits in somewhat with what we were talking about today, or what Professor Bulliet was talking about today. And I just have many more questions, but I'd like to kind of give the floor to everyone who's been listening patiently, and I'm sure has some really interesting questions to ask. So thank you so much, Professor Bulliet, for again inspiring all of us, or inspiring me at least, with your thought-provoking ideas. Yes, and thanks for giving this forum, everyone. Thanks.
Let me, before we get some other voices, let me just make some brief response to what Owen said, which I appreciate very much. He's obviously read an awful lot of stuff I've written. And his remarks, I think, were very accurate. I mean, they do reflect the way that I have approached history throughout my career. And when I do hope that some people will look at my book on Methodists and Muslims and my life as an Orientalist, because, as Owen pointed out, I think it's a process. No historian is born with the notion of what history is. It grows and emerges with their own experience. And I think typically in American history study, the experience that people have had has been with reading the great historians, starting with Herodotus and Thucydides and so forth. I never read these until I'd already finished my PhD. And when I did read them, I didn't find they moved me very, very much. What moved me were experiences with getting into the lives of people who'd lived in what I thought were far different civilizations in time and space. And then I was sort of, after about 20 years, I think it occurred to me that those families I described in Nishapur weren't that different from the ones I grew up around. Protestant Methodists in Rockford, Illinois. And then after another decade or so, I thought, well, my God, really, was I really just transposing my life experience onto my historical work? And I suspect that a lot of historians do that, and that the works that they write are manifestations of their lives, whether they're writing about their own society. I think of very powerful historians who write about 19th and 20th century Western society, Americans and Europeans, or whether they're writing about societies elsewhere. You're always writing to some degree in an unknowing way about yourself. And in my discussions with Owen when he was writing his doctoral thesis, I kept thinking, well, Owen, you're trying to do so much and to have so many things that feed into your interests that arise in many ways from your personal background and your family. But you can't do it all at once. And I would keep trimming him down, and he would keep expanding, and I'd trim down, and he'd keep expanding. But I think it is a characteristic of historians that they're writing histories of others that in some way, as the Borges story suggests, are histories of themselves. So that's all I have to say in response.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much describing Professor Bulliet, Owen Miller. Thank you. And then as a response, Professor Bulliet also made a short description of oven 2. On that note, now we are going for Q&A. We have perhaps half an hour for the questions. Let's take Hamid. Let me unmute you. Okay. Go ahead, Hamid.
Hi, you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your talk. You mentioned briefly about a modus vivendi between modern secularism and Islamic world. Do you think this would come about by some sort of Islamic reform? If so, do you see any individuals or current movements that has such a potential? Thank you very much.
I have thought about that to some degree, and I have met a number of people who feel that they are people who should be listened to in that respect. And yet I tend to think that the growth of a modus vivendi happens at a street level more than at the level of intellectual intervention. I mean, I'm thinking now of all the many, many Muslims who are observing Ramadan, and of the many, many Muslims who are not observing Ramadan, but who know perfectly well they should be observing Ramadan. And then those who are sort of observing Ramadan, but, well, maybe making an exception here and there. And it's, accommodation occurs at a street level and ultimately gets crystallized at an intellectual level. I'm a social historian. I don't believe in great men. I don't believe in transformative thought. Partly it's because when I read philosophy or great thinkers, I find their work interesting often, but 2 days later, I can't remember what they said. And yet I'm always interested in how they go about their lives, how they react to other people. I think that the Muslim reformers, and this is foolish of me to generalize about something I'm not at all expert on, but it seems to me that many of them are thinking about Islam in the sense of purifying Islam, or getting rid of the purple area and telling us what Islam should be, or they are interested in some sort of institutionalization of interactions between Muslims and non-Muslims. I think that the thought that I haven't yet seen really is the thought that that represents how Islamophobia is being understood. Islamophobia is like a poison in the world of interaction. And I think if you just think about Islam against itself, if you say, how can Islam be made more? How can Tawheed be emphasized more? How can medieval excrescences or superstitions be eliminated, which a number of reformers have done? It's really the point of interaction with the people who despise Islam that I think people condemn it. Obviously, one condemns Islamophobia. One warns people against the hate speech and action that has become so common. But to some degree, that the middle ground that ultimately I think has to be carved out, has to disarm that Islamophobia. I mean, now the most radical people simply think the only good Muslim is a dead Muslim. But you know, I haven't read reformers who look at the middle ground very much. I mean, this was essentially what I intended when I coined the phrase Islamo-Christian civilization, is to try to find a way to think about the middle ground, to accept the existence of an Islamophobic present, and yet to set it within a historical context in which there could be hope for a lasting accommodation between Muslims and modern non-Muslims. That's all.
All right, we have another person, Saqib Qureshi. No mute. Go ahead, Saqib.
Hi, Professor Bulliet. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, and of course for all the work that you've done in the field of history and Islamic history in particular. I have several questions. I'm going to try to summarize it as best I can, but it's really 3 topics. And in a review essay of yours titled "Islamic Reformation or Big Crunch," where you reviewed Khalid ibn Fadl and Tariq Ramadan's modernist approaches to reform, you mentioned how Islamic history has often gone through what you called the big crunch. In other words, there's this influx of new sort of ideas and different modes of being, and then there's this sort of tug back and forth between them, and eventually, across some span of time, it leads to this big crunch, and there's this sort of reconciliation. And what's interesting, what you point out, is that from that reconciliation onwards, the past is actually reread in terms of that big crunch. So there's antinomian Sufis, but that gets kind of pushed off to the side. There's all these fabricated weak hadiths, but that gets filtered out. And you mentioned how this big crunch has occurred between sort of early debates with hadith between Iraq and Sham, and how that canonized into the Sahih Sahih and sort of these canonized hadith books. And also you mentioned about sort of, well, since I read it, but I'm just trying to hope I don't misquote. You also mentioned about antinomian Sufis and more Shara'i Sufis, and how Sufism became a bit more Shara'i oriented. But what I found interesting is possibly a gap in terms of the contemporary period, where you say there needs to be this reconciliation between Islam and the West, in that specifically the Ottoman period. Past sort of Orientalist historiography of the Ottoman period saw the Ottoman history sort of naturally transitioning into the secular Turkish Republic. We know now that's not necessarily the case. There was this sort of reconciliation of Islam and modernity with the Tanzimat, with sort of the idea of constitutional caliphate, military reforms, the codification of the legal system. And it doesn't seem so much as a natural progression to the Turkish Republic, but more so as just a, one-stop abolishment after World War I with Ataturk and whatnot. So my first question is, do you see that period with the Ottomans and this experiment with modernity and the reconciliation as sort of it's almost on the verge of that big crunch, but then it's like a comet just occurs right in the middle, and then, all of that sort of disappears. And my second question in terms of reform is 2 things. One, in terms of power relations, and 2, decoloniality. So if we look at past reforms, there's always this idea where Muslims are still they still have, in a sense, they're not working from an inferior perspective. They're not colonized. They're not sort of saying, oh, the West is so advanced and, we're sort of behind. Whether it's with the Greeks or with, Sufi cosmologies and stuff, there's always this idea of Muslims being sort of at the forefront of civilization. So how do you envision reform today in terms of the power relations of the Muslim world and the West, in that, the post-colonial period, just being behind economically, scientifically, technologically, etc. And then two, in terms of decoloniality, there's this sort of contemporary critique of the West in that it's been, Western science and technology has also had a bad side. It's led to wars, it's justified colonialism, and it's led to, destruction of cultures. Nationalism itself has led to destruction of lots of cultures and, indigenous languages and whatnot. So how do you envision reform in terms of those two, power relations and decoloniality? And sorry, my last question is on the caliphate. So you mentioned how you didn't see the caliphate as a sort of this form of unity, ummadic sort of unity. But I feel like there is this different picture of it, because we have Ghazali himself saying that even if the caliphate becomes a puppet, it's still we still need it as a symbolic sense of unity. And in a sense, extremist groups like ISIS and whatnot that that are have come up with this distorted view of caliphate still sort of tells us that the idea of caliphate is still in the minds of Muslims. So how does that idea relate to your conception of Islamic history? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me take the caliphate part of it first. Al-Ghazali died in 1111. The caliphate still existed in his day. It was losing its status in many ways, but how could he not say that it was necessary? I mean, it's what people had to say as long as there was a caliphate. But when you look at thinkers in, from the 14th century onward, the question of the meaning of a caliphate really does fade dramatically. And I've argued at some point that the chief political office in Islam shifts from being caliph to being the servitor of the two holy places, Qadim al-Haramain. And that when people came on Hajj and they saw who was feeding them and building buildings and so forth in Mecca and Medina, first the Ayyubids, then the Ottomans, then the Mamluks, then the Ottomans, now the Saudis, that they came away thinking, well, that is your central expression of a political leadership in Islam. And I think that the decision by the Saudi regime to destroy so many of the historic buildings and replace them with grandiose buildings culminating in the incredibly tall and bulky building that now overlooks the Kaaba. I think that simply is continuing the notion that there is a political centrality, but that it's associated with the domination of the Hajj rather than the things that a caliphate did, like a caliph authorized coinage. A caliph had a khutbah said in his name. These things are medieval. They're pretty much gone. And I think that the ISIS, the effort to create a new caliphate, was so profoundly misguided as to what the caliphate was. And even before ISIS, you had Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden said in his propaganda, he said, people must give up their jobs wherever they are in the dunya. And they had to move to Afghanistan, where they be trained to become warriors, and then they would fight jihad, and then their concern with the next life took priority over the concern with this life. And to justify that, he said you had to have a caliph to justify the jihad. But he wasn't the caliph, and he never claimed to be. He said that the Mullah Muhammad Omar, the head of the Taliban, was the Amir al-Mu'mineen. And he essentially named the caliph and said, here's your caliph, and so you must come to Afghanistan and participate in jihad under his aegis. I don't know what Mullah Muhammad Omar thought of bin Laden in that particular respect, but that is something that has a history. When you go back to the late Ottoman Empire, at the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Sultan authorized a Muslim revolutionary in northwest China, Yaqub Beg, authorized him to use the title Amir al-Mu'mineen, as if somehow anybody could name a caliph. And it degraded the notion of what the caliph had ever been. And I don't think there has been any political structure that has come close to replacing it. Going back to your first question, having to do with Tanzimat and so on. Certainly one of the most formative books in my becoming a Middle East scholar was the reading of Bernard Lewis's The Rise of Modernism in Modern Turkey, his book on modern Turkey. And I think that was the best book he ever wrote. And yet, when I look back on it, I increasingly see it as an expression of modernization theory. That the premise underlying the book is primarily a theory devised by Americans and a few Europeans that would explain the inevitability of Western views becoming dominant worldwide in a process of modernization. So the emergence of modern Turkey was expressing that. And in the third edition of the book, where he writes a new introduction talking about how he came to write the book, he says that he had been in Istanbul in 1950 when there had been an open election and the government of Ataturk had been, of İsmet İnönü had been voted out of office, and you'd had a peaceful change of office to a new government. And Lewis says, on that day, I saw the future of the Middle East, a future of open, fair elections, contesting between various political parties, and the party in power stepping down and yielding to the party that is newly elected. And that is where he literally says, I saw the future there. And he ignores the fact that that government was overthrown by a revolution 10 years later. And he also uses that vision to justify his later book called What Went Wrong, sort of taking his vision as being the right path that Turkey and, by extension, the Middle East should have taken. And they didn't take that path, but rather they followed a different path. And that was wrong. And that kind of judgment of who is to say what is the right path to the future? And is it to be American political scientists or English modern historians who declare for the world, here is the way you should go. And if you don't go that way, then you are wrong, because I will never be wrong. Well, as I look back, I think of the Tanzimat era, from its beginning down to, and also in some degree, culminating in the reign of Abdulhamid II. I see it more as a period of destroying a working social, religious set of institutions and replacing them with something else that was problematic in how it would work, and of course took several generations to work out as well as it could, but it did not effectively erase what came before it. And I don't think that I think that is less a right direction that was attempted and that failed, so much as an effort by a fairly small cadre of people to impose upon the area what ultimately comes to be thought of as modernization. And of course, it was then followed by Reza Shah in Iran, and King of Afghanistan, who was a modernizer. And this was not a successful direction. I'm not going to say whether right or wrong, but it wasn't successful. And oddly enough, the Western thinkers who were so avid in telling us what was the right direction to go, when they came down to the 1950s and after, in the aftermath of World War II, when they were expounding this set of theories that were based upon economics and information dissemination of a modern sort and so forth, these thinkers were more or less obtuse when it came to looking at the actuality. So that a generation that, Lewis's generation, say, that had come out of World War II, seeing that as the great story of fighting fascism and totalitarian government, that you had to fight these things. They were evil. They should be destroyed. They were destroyed. We triumphed. But then they turned out to be absolutely blind to the rise of fascism in the areas that they were talking about. So that when you had fascistic totalitarian tendencies arising through many countries in the Muslim world, that wasn't something to worry about. That was something to work with, because these totalitarian autocrats were often people who who accepted money from the West, who became directly connected with military agreements with the West, and the West saw them as agents of modernization. So I think that the question is, is modernization your focus, or is totalitarianism your focus? And the Europeans, the Americans said, totalitarian is unacceptable in Europe. But hey, outside of Europe, it's not so bad. And in fact, it may be the right road to the future. Well, history, I don't think will treat Tanzimat kindly in the long run. But it grows more out of the ideological tendencies in the West than it does out of a more organic growth of thought within Muslim societies. So I don't see that as a right path that was somehow deviated from in subsequent times. Now there's a question of decoloniality. I think that's the first time I've actually uttered the word, because it is the rise of colonial subjectivity is something that coincided with sort of the end days of my career, and also gets associated with the follow-on thinking that arises from the important interventions of Edward Said. But here at my home university, Edward Said has become sort of a, the local saint. If you don't agree with Edward, you have no place in the Middle East program. I must admit that when I retired, I believe a number of people in the Middle East faculty at Columbia were absolutely delighted to see me go because I was not sufficiently devoted to Edward and his legacy. And yet, if you look at the room behind me, this is where Edward wrote Orientalism. I'm living in his apartment. I've lived here longer than he did, I believe. And this was his study, which is now my study. So as a room, there's probably been more written about the Middle East in this room than any other room in the United States. But I did not really know Edward. He lived in the same building. I was living upstairs. He was living in this apartment. We would say hello, but in our 17 years of overlapping in the faculty, we had no significant conversation. And I never became engaged in the discussions of colonial subjectivity and decoloniality that are introduced by your question. So I can't really say much about that. I'm just a guy from Illinois, not someone who has suffered from the imposition of a colonialized mentality. Metin?
There is one more question, probably would be the last one, from Hasib N. Go ahead, Hasib.
He's muted.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you, Professor, for such a wonderful presentation. And I'm from India, and here is now almost 1 o'clock in the AM. So my question is that wherever Islam expansion taking place, Islam always tries to uphold the regional flavor. A kind of multiculturalism always been the identity of Islamic expansion. For example, from my state in Kerala, southern part of India, Islam tried to absorb some of the Hindu tradition without losing its identity. It's like itibad, affirmation, nafi and negation. That means that is what I wanted to mean by without losing its identity. So could you please talk a bit on this multicultural attitude of Islam and Islamic expansion? Thank you.
Yes, you're quite right. This is characteristic of how Islam expanded in India. But if you were to look at the expansion of Islam in West Africa, where you have the Sokoto Caliphate, where you have the Fulani jihads, you go back far enough into the history of sub-Saharan Africa in the West, in the western part of it, and you find a sort of a state in which you have one center that is Muslim and one center that is pagan. And when you have the rise of states, you often have a conflict between magicians who are using magic against one another. And I mentioned magic in the Southern Philippines. The Southern Philippines is simply a branch of the Malay world, spiritual universe, and magic is very common there. What is magic? I mean, there are people who specialize in this, but it's something that is a form of interaction that isn't the same as what you would get between communities in India. And if you look at the expansion of Islam into China, which had tremendous commercial aspect to it, where Muslim merchants and shopkeepers and so forth were much more important than thinkers and writers. And you don't get the same thing you get in India. And there's the question of the expansion of Islam into the United States, where the interaction between Muslims who are of immigrant background, many of them from South Asia, and Muslims who are of African American background, many of them had started with the Ahmadiyya or with the Nation of Islam, or nowadays Muslims who are white Americans, often attracted by Sufism. This is the same as what you have in India. So what I was trying to say in my main talk is that Islam has had this remarkable adaptability to evolve intermediate spaces and accommodation between itself and whatever societies it contacts. And in India, what you're talking about is absolutely right, as far as I know, in talking about Islam in India or in many parts of India. But it wouldn't work in the same way in Java or in Shanghai or in Iowa City in the United States. I mean, it's the plurality and the variability and the sort of creative capacity of Islam to evolve these intermediate positions that singles it out as such a terribly important phenomenon in world history.
I think he likes to add some. Let me see. Should we take another question, Professor Bulliet?
It's fine with me. I'm just,
okay, one last one then. Let's see. Yeah.
Mr. Qureshi wants to respond.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go. Hold on a second. One more time. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Professor, for your inspiring speech about the Islam and in the world history. In your speech, you mentioned about the notion of Ummah and a kind of working tradition until the beginning of the 20th century. And it is most probably because of the role of the ulama until this period. But after then, it was somehow corrupted under the nation states, maybe because of the Western influence. And at the same time, you also mentioned about 3 periods of 600 years. And the third period was somehow the tradition which we are still in. And do you believe that despite this corruption in this tradition of transmission of the knowledge, of the Islamic knowledge, do you still see it possible that the Islamic world will reunite again?
I don't think that it will reunite politically. And it hasn't been united politically, of course, in many centuries. The question of the role of the ulama is part of the transition that I think we are living through. Historically, I've written a great deal about the workings of the Society of Ulama in the medieval period. particularly the importance of having chains of authority that go back to the prophet or the companions, and the desirability of transmitting sacred lore verbatim from generation to generation, so that every alim had to start with the study of hadith. And they had to start with the studying the hadith by voice. You had to hear it spoken by a teacher. And that kept the community of the ulama, defined it fairly closely. You had to come from a family that had enough money for you to spend your young years listening to hadith and learning Arabic and memorizing Quran. And then you had to transition. You would marry, have a family, work and start a job, and then when you became old, you would transmit the hadith you heard when you were young. But it was a fairly cohesive society, and it was very important that celibacy was not part of this, so that you actually had whole dynasties of ulama who transmitted lore from generation to generation. In the 20th century, this changed dramatically. And it changed because of the spread of publications. Not all at once, but you started to have people who became known because of what they wrote rather than what they said verbatim in class. So that El-Manar, classic reformist journal, you would write something and people would read it. Famously, Muhammad Abdu is read in South Africa and taken as an authority there in a fatwa. So you go from having authority being based upon what you hear from a sheikh in a classroom, and this applies to ulama in most parts of the world, to reading books and then believing them. Well, maybe you believe them, maybe you don't. You read the back of the book and it says, Sheikh, Fulan, Fulan Fulana, studied at Al-Azhar, or he didn't study at all. And you have people who become authorities on Islam who are not ulama and who have not gone through that sort of almost guild-like training. And then you have the rise of videotaped sermons and internet muftis and radio muftis. And that changes the notion of where does authority lie? Does authority lie in the guild-like structure of the ulama, predicated upon the existence of a madrasa or equivalent institution where you have word-of-mouth training of the sort you would still have in madrasas in Pakistan and other areas? Or does it lie in the publications? And if in the publications, which publications? Is it up to the reader to determine what is an important thought, as opposed to accepting as a diligent student that the professor's thoughts are axiomatically good because he said them? I'm looking at one diligent student right now. And we haven't really discovered, I think that the old notion of the ulama is largely gone, but we haven't yet found a formula that can mingle authority, persuasive authority in a religious societal sense, with with some sort of originality of thought. And of course, one of the very important changes in all this is that the Guild of Ulama rarely had any females in it. But as soon as authority moves to the printed text or to electronic texts, the world opens up, as we all know, to the other half of the world's population to have their thoughts and inputs. And there can be no evolving synthesis that is unisexual. It is going to involve the thoughts of women and of men both. But I don't think that it's going to be structured the way it has been. And indeed, I come from a tradition here in the United States that is basically medieval in terms of how to teach people. You go to a university and you sit in a class with a professor and you listen to lectures and so on. I'm not sure that after the COVID pandemic and the rise of sessions like this that are international and yet essentially free, I'm not sure that we will be able to sustain the way we have looked at education of the intelligentsia in the West, who are our equivalent of the ulama, because I think that we're in a state of dramatic change worldwide in terms of the development and spread and implementation of ideas, and that we should not feel that the future is going to be defined by a group that we can say a priori, these are the thinkers that will be of importance.
There was one more question, but then I think he dropped out. On that case, if there is no other questions, we can, I think, come to the end of the session. This was a great session, actually. Thank you very much for both of you, especially Professor Bulliet and Dr. Ofen Miller. I think, it was the start of our series too, and I wasn't expecting that many people to come. I'd like to thank everyone who were present here too for listening. Hopefully once we start a YouTube channel too, we'll be able to post that session as well.
Okay. Metin, thank you very much for inviting me. I haven't had an opportunity to hold forth for such a long period of time for a number of years, and it's been a great fun. I've enjoyed talking to you and to everybody else who has been listening to this. Thank you very much.
Hopefully we will be joining in another session too then, since I feel that you are really enjoying that kind of conversations. For years you said you haven't been talking on Islam and Middle East, and hopefully we will be having you back, especially seeing that you are really still young and energetic, taking that opportunity. I hope to have you again.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Okay, have a great night. See you all.
Take care.